Welcome back to day 2 of the Standards Summit 2025. We hope you all enjoyed the general session and your consensus body breakout sessions yesterday. We hope it was filled with game-changing collaboration, with some leveling up of standards. And, today we're going to add the celebration to the mix. For those of you attending in person, we have an awards event tonight at 6 p.m. at Chaos. Everyone is invited. Please don't miss out on this fun event. This morning's general session builds on yesterday's session. Today we will hear about IICRC standards and how we do it. Yesterday was the what is it that we do, and today we'll talk about how we do it. Our speaker today is Brandon Burton, IICRC's Standards Chair, and he is joining us virtually. This session will be recorded and made available after the summit. A little bit about Brandon Burton. Throughout his 30-year career in the restoration industry, Brandon has worked to support rapidly developing technology and industry best practices with a passion for promoting the restoration industry's continued growth and professionalism. Brandon is the Senior Principal of Industry Relations for CoreLogic and previously filled the role of Technical Director of Legend Brands. He currently serves as the Standards Chair for IICRC Standards and as Vice Chair of the S500 Consensus Body. And with that, please help me welcome Brandon Burton.
And honored to be here, even virtually, to share a topic that I am extremely passionate about, that I've grown to become even more passionate for as I've worked with standards, especially in the role of Standards Chair. When I stepped into the role of Standards Chair, I'll admit, I was not real clear exactly, how I would be able to make an impact or to assist in the work that we do in standards, but very quickly kind of grew into a passion for understanding the pillars for successful standard writing that I want to talk through with everybody today as we get into the how we do it of development of standards. So with that, if you could advance one slide for me. So to kind of unpack the information that we're going to run through today, I kind of want to give kind of a general overview of the two main topics that we're going to touch on. One is going to be unpacking what I call the pillars for successful standards, and in that discussing the foundational aspects of what really drives not only a successful standard, but what drives a successful consensus body, which is the heart of the standard development process. And then secondarily, I want to go through a conversation on applying those pillars to two different workflows. One of the workflows that many of you are engaged in is the development of new standards, starting from scratch, so to speak, and publishing a standard on an area or topic for the very first time for ANSI and IICRC. The second workflow is the revision process and how we take an existing standard and we apply these pillars to developing a revision to an existing published document. So again, kind of in two buckets here. First, let's talk about the core. Let's talk about the pillars and what's foundational to either of these workflows. And then we'll talk through the workflows themselves. When we get into the workflows, this will be the first time that we've really discussed how this applies to new standards. For existing standards and revision, we do have existing consensus bodies that have begun to apply this methodology already, and to a very large degree of success. And we'll kind of unpack some of that as we go. So with that, let's just roll up our sleeves and dive into it. So if you'll advance one slide for me. The first pillar, and I've ordered these in what I would argue to be, the criticality of each of these pillars. The first pillar is consensus. We as a group, as a committee, as a standards writing body, first and foremost have a commitment to ensuring that we have consensus on the information that we are documenting and publishing within our standards. And consensus is foundational to everything that we do, whether we're creating new content, we're revising content. At the end of the day, the onus on our consensus bodies, and it's right in their title, is that as a group, we have gained a general agreement, and where possible, unanimous agreement on what we are documenting as standard of care. And we've spoke that extensively on what standard of care means and what standard of care represents. Darren had an opportunity to unpack a bit again on what standard of care represents yesterday. And one of the things that I'll never pass on an opportunity to say as we talk about standard of care is that what we're gaining consensus on is what is common among reasonably prudent practitioners of the trade, right? And that phrase, that statement is a statement I think that all of us as standards volunteers, it's really critical that we commit that to kind of our permanent foundational programming as we approach everything that we do within a consensus body, right? We're not trying to gain consensus on what we feel is the best way, what we feel is the state of the art methodology. We're trying to gain consensus on what is common among reasonably prudent members of the trade. And really just can't hit that hard enough and how important, how critical that is. And again, we'll touch on that again a bit as we go through kind of deeper into the presentation. If you'll advance one slide for me. The second pillar for a successful workflow as a consensus body or product as a standard is documentation. And one of the things that that we've had as a part of our foundation for as long as I can remember being a part of standards is that we do have very solid documentation in a couple of the tools that we use within standards. And just real simply to overview those, we capture minutes, we record minutes, we validate that those minutes are accurate. We have motions to memorialize that. We have our working drafts as a document. We have track changes. These all serve critical pieces of the documentation. But what's missing in a lot of that documentation is what I like to call the what, the why, and the where, as it relates to understanding what the consensus body has actually done to derive what is the standard of care. And that's part of what I want to unpack here. And this will relate very deeply into the workflows when we get into it here in just a moment. But first, the what. What we need to document is, first and foremost, the exact scope of what we as a consensus body are setting out to do. So consensus on what will be included and the objective or procedural impacts that we are trying to accomplish through our standard of care language. And when I get into the workflows, I'll kind of explain what I mean by that and how that applies and why that's so critical to the process. We also need to document the why, the supporting information. As an entity, I think our standards consensus bodies as a whole have taken huge strides forward in this area. But supporting information such as sources, the reasons or logic that stand up the standard of care content and the authenticity of those sources, I think that we have improved in this area quite a bit. But I think our process, whether we're developing a new standard or an existing standard, should also serve to document that for us more clearly. Not necessarily in the document that we publish, but in the documentation that we're producing to initiate those efforts that we're undertaking to develop that content. And again, I'll kind of allude a bit more to what I mean by that as we get into the workflows. If you'll advance one more slide for me. The next pillar for successful standard development is in the precision and clarity of the information that we're documenting. And the slide hasn't advanced on my end. I'm not sure if it has on yours. There we go. The precision and clarity of what we're documenting is also critical, and something that just even reflecting on the breakout session that I was a part of yesterday with the S500 and S550 consensus bodies meeting jointly. Now, this topic is something that came up, and just how important it is that the language that we are producing and that we're putting out to those that it truly serves, serving the project and the individuals that are managing and undertaking that project, whatever type of project it is. If we're not precise and we're not clear in the language that we're producing, it creates a significant amount of ambiguity. And ambiguity means that the document itself isn't serving really its true purpose, which is to ensure at the end of the day that project is being performed in a way that is consistent with what is common among those reasonably prudent practitioners. And there are lots of reasons why our language starts to lose its precision, starts to lose its clarity. Much of that comes from kind of a conflict with the fourth pillar that I'll get to here in just a second. But some of it comes from the fact that we have, competing views as consensus body members. We do a lot of work on language to try to ensure that we are capturing sometimes competing viewpoints into a single standard of care statement. And the cost of that can very often become that the language itself is not as precise and as clear as it really should be. And again, we'll get into the process and we'll talk about how we can manage that and how we can circumvent that, whether we're developing new standards or existing standards. From precision and clarity, the fourth pillar that has become probably more of a challenge for us as an organization than it ever has before over the course of the last probably 5, 6, 7 years is harmonization and synergy. This is quite honestly, this is a new mountain for us to climb as a group and one that we're learning to climb, but we have a long ways to go. And the reason that it's a new mountain for us to climb is because we have so much greater diversity in the standards that we're developing, with specificity in several areas or subsets within the specialized trades that we publish standards for. Additional iterations, if you will, of the numerical 500 series or whatever series it is, where we go deeper into detail into specific subsets of a particular trade. This creates a phenomenal amount of complexity as it relates to harmonization and synergy. And it's not an easy task. It's not an easy undertaking. I don't think that any of us would say that the reason why we join standards and volunteer for standards is because it's easy, right? That's definitely not the reason that we're involved. And this layer of the onion, so to speak, makes that task even more challenging. And it's also a reason why the documentation of and the kind of the guidance and guardrails of some process and procedure is so critical and so helpful as we move forward, so that we can do a better job of understanding how to harmonize various standards that we're developing and understand how those documents work together to create a synergy in whatever subject area those standards are addressing. So kind of recapping this on the pillars, first and foremost, consensus, right? Regardless of what it is that is provided to us for guardrails and guidance and suggestions on how we move forward in the development of standards, what you'll always hear me say first is that at the end of the day, our documents are consensus of the body that has been selected to comprise that consensus body, right? Consensus rules. And that consensus, if it does rule and it rules effectively, it addresses a lot of the other issues that we are that are so critical to manage under the essential requirements, as long as consensus is truly honored. Documentation, so we have the information necessary to stand up where our standard of care language comes from, the sources for that information, and again, in process, we'll talk a little bit about why that's so critical. Precision and clarity, so that our users understand what we're documenting and they can apply what we're documenting. It's practical for the work that they're doing. And then lastly, but not least, harmonization and synergy to ensure that our published standards between themselves don't create conflict. So those are the pillars. And again, to kind of stand this up, as we get into the process side, the heart of the presentation today, and talk about the new standards process and existing standards process, I want you to reflect on those four pillars and how what we're setting out to accomplish in either case is truly to honor those as the core principles of the standard writing process. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into the workflows themselves. First, we'll start with the new standard writing. Then we'll get into the revision of existing standards. So with writing a new standard, there are several different ways in which various consensus bodies have gone after and attacked the process of developing a new standard. And it can be a bit overwhelming at first when you're starting out from a blank sheet of paper and we're trying to develop what we have 10, 12, 14, 16 individuals in a room all have, core areas of expertise in, although those expertise are all based on, various experiences and not necessarily 100% synonymous. And then trying to, basically, synthesize that down into a single clear document for what is standard of care. And just how to start and where to start and how to get the process moving forward can be a very overwhelming task. And I think anybody who has chaired a new standard or vice chaired a new standard can definitely reflect on just how overwhelming that can feel. If it doesn't feel overwhelming just before the first meeting, it feels overwhelming after the first meeting when you realize just how much work there is to do. So how do we go about this and how do we attack it? There are three core phases that are critical to the process. The first core phase is just understanding what it is as a consensus body that you're setting out to document, right? What is the true scope, purpose, and application of the document? And it's a critical area to start because this area, once we gain consensus on what the scope is, what the purpose is, and what the application is, there are several kind of byproducts of that, and we'll unpack those. Those come from your ANSI pins, and we'll talk a little bit about the pins. I know Millie has talked a bit about pins yesterday and in the past, but I think it's going to be a critical instrument, if you will, the pins, for us to unpack and better understand, because especially for those that are developing new standards, really leveraging the pins itself can give you a huge leg forward in understanding what you're setting out to accomplish. Once we have a scope, purpose, and application, the second phase is then having consensus on the core outline of the document. And this serves as the guardrail for your consensus body on what it is you're actually setting out to document underneath that scope, purpose, and application. It can be revised and it can vary as you move through the process, but it's critical to start with that guardrail. And we'll kind of unpack that as we take a look at this in detail. And then finally, a third phase where the actual content underneath those section outlines is reviewed by the consensus body as a whole. So let's take a look at each one of these phases and kind of understand kind of the details in each one of these phases and some best practices that'll help guide a consensus body through new standard development. Starting with phase one, if you'll advance one slide for me. So with this first phase, the guiding document that we need to take a look at is the ANSI pins. The ANSI pins is going to help us with key guardrails, if you will, that help us establish what this document is setting out to accomplish. Not only does it set the title, it sets the explanation of the need for the standard and why the standard is being developed. It establishes who the stakeholders are, right? Who are those that are impacted by this standard or have an interest in the information that's being published in the standard. It also gives us description of the contents of the standard. The ANSI pins is critical for various reasons. One of those reasons being that this is the formal and official record approved by ANSI for us to move forward in the development of a standard. And any change to that pins is a substantive change before the standard has even been published. So it's not only critical from the standpoint that it helps us set up what we're setting out to accomplish, it's also critical because it restricts what we're setting out to accomplish. And if there is a need by the consensus body to make a revision in the title, in the need of the document, in the stakeholders, et cetera, then we actually need to resubmit that pins. Otherwise, we're going to run into big problems once we get out to public review, right? Because technically the standard does not match what was originally approved as an ANSI standard. So unpacking the pins a bit deeper, if we'll advance one slide, let's take a look at what the pins actually is. First of all, what is pins? It is a project initiation notification system under ANSI. And the pins is going to include who is the standard developer and the information there, the title, like I said before, the explanation of the need, the stakeholders, the description of contents. And what I'm showing you over on the right-hand side of the slide here is the actual electronic form that Millie or someone of Millie's role would complete as an ANSI standard developer in the application of the pins before we ever even begin the consensus body process. Let's take a closer look at that form for a second because it's going to be useful as we get a bit deeper into the process. If we'll advance one more slide. So kind of going down through some of the various information that's captured here. First of all, what is the actual title? and the title, being the first part of developing that scope of the document. What is the intent or the type of project that is going to be undertaken as an American national standard? Does it supersede anything else? Is it a part of ISO, IEC, et cetera? Advance one slide for me. We get into the heart here now as we get into the project need, the stakeholders, and the interest categories. This is the first part I want to really slow down. So stakeholders, right? When we develop a standard, one of the things that must be documented is who are the stakeholders of that specific project. This is a direct informant to our scope, purpose, and application. And in that PINS, if there is a stakeholder group that the consensus body either is not intending to write to or is intending to write to that has not been identified in that PINS, that's a critical conversation to identify right up front. What are the interest categories and who are expected to comprise the consensus body? Again, if there's an interest category that needs to be represented by the consensus body itself and that has not been documented, this is something that is critical for us to address right up front. If you'll advance one slide for me. And then some additional information here about whether or not this revises a previous PINS, et cetera, et cetera. Now, once we roll together the various forms of the PINS application, if you'll advance again for me one more slide. This is going to inform the first core step of the consensus body, where we take the scope, purpose, and application and the PINS document, and we begin to articulate, what is the true intent of this particular document. And here's the first part of the process that I want to kind of expand, is that when a consensus body first begins the process of developing a new standard, I highly, highly suggest that the first project is undertaken by the chair and the vice chair directly in preparation for those first calls of the consensus body. And that preparation is taking the first pass at the development of the scope, purpose, and application to serve a couple of different purposes. First and foremost, as the chair and vice chair, it gives you an opportunity to establish as leadership for that consensus body your intent as the chair and vice chair for what the scope of the document will be, its purpose, and how it will be applied. It also gives you the opportunity to set the tone for the writing style within the document and how the language is going to be presented within the document. Typically, for most of you, if you filled a chair or a vice chair role, it likely is because you've participated in standards development prior. Not always the case, but likely. And you probably have a feel for how a standard document is going to read. And quite honestly, that's one of the hardest obstacles to overcome for volunteers coming into the standard development process who have not been a part of that standard development process prior, right? It's just the writing style and the language style within the document. So by taking on the scope, purpose, and application, drafting that scope, purpose, and application, you serve a couple of different purposes. Like I said, first and foremost, it gives you an opportunity to have something to look at with your consensus body when you begin those first several or first handful of meetings. It gives you something to practice the motions and votes on as you look at this language and review first the scope, identify the scope, modify the scope with the participation of your consensus body, write the scope in a way that matches the style of writing, and then finally move and vote, and then move to purpose, et cetera, then move to application, et cetera. It gives you a way in which you kind of set the tone, set the context, and ensure before any content is developed that you have consensus with your body on the precision and clarity of the information that is going to be captured by your standard through the standard development process. All right, so that's the first step. Scope, purpose, and application, PINS driven. The second step in the process with new standards development is then to develop a section outline. This is another document that I would highly encourage is first drafted by your chair and vice chair. What is your vision for how this document is going to be organized? How are you going to start? What core subject areas need to be broken apart into standalone sections? What are the key objectives of those sections in terms of the content that they will contain? This doesn't have to be standard of care language, right? This isn't where you're writing your shalls and your shoulds, et cetera. This is you setting the map, saying, here is the way that we're going to approach the topic that we have been set out to approach under the pins that was administered by IICRC. Then you bring this again to your consensus body. Once scope, purpose, and application have been defined, this becomes the second project of your consensus body. We then move as a consensus body through the outline. We discuss the outline. We discuss the sections. We identify in our consensus body who the subject matter experts are that are most passionate about each one of the topics that are being identified by the outline. We identify gaps in the outline by the other subject matter experts that are in the consensus body. We make edits to the outline based on that information, based on that content, and then we move and vote each of the sections and approve that outline as the guardrails, if you will, for those particular sections. Once that section has been approved, at that point, your consensus body should be at a point where through those discussions, now we fully understand, the breadth of passion, the breadth of subject matter expertise that each of our consensus body members may have for particular areas within the standard. We have consensus on what exactly the standard is going to outline and cover, how deep we're going to go with what objectives into each of those areas. And again, it's not that this can't be modified in some way as the process continues, but what it does set out is as soon as Section 2, for example, is moved and voted, that if there is going to be a modification for the scope of that particular section, then it's going to require a motion. It's going to require discussion, and it's going to require a vote. And this is the first opportunity where I want to take a moment and kind of drive home, again, the pillars of the process. Consensus being key, right? Consensus rules all. And the consensus should be established right up front. Consensus on which sections will be contained within the document, and then consensus on the scope of that section. It's not to say that consensus can't be reinformed, but when consensus is reinformed and someone decides that, hey, Section 3 is missing some critical areas or objectives, then that needs to be brought back to the consensus body. And an argument needs to be made that Section 3 needs the following modification in its outline. A motion needs to be made. That motion needs to be voted. It needs to be accepted by the consensus body. So we ensure that as that particular group sets out to write the language for Section 3, they have clear understanding that there is consensus from the main body that particular modification needs to be made. Now, kind of zooming out a little bit on the section outline and talking about it from a bit higher level, the section outlines, again, expand the scope, purpose, and application detail. They allow for the consensus body to vote and gain consensus on that more detailed scope. But most importantly, from a procedural standpoint, it allows the consensus body to assign an individual that will be a chair for that particular section. Right. One word of caution that I would give you, and I know a couple of you in the room may chuckle from this a little bit, but be very careful about how heavily individual volunteers commit on particular sections, and look at your consensus body and try to really spread that work. We have many standards volunteers that are very eager to participate in the process, and I commend those that want to be involved in every step and every section and every detail. But the challenge is that it becomes overwhelming very quickly. So it's very important as standards leaders, standards chairs and vice chairs rather, that we are cognizant of that and try to really spread that work across the consensus body as a whole. But assign those chairs become responsible for particular sections of the document. And once you are responsible for that document, you have a subcommittee, right? And one of the things that I don't see enough of in our consensus bodies that I would really encourage we do more of is have the consensus body do the work of consensus and have a subcommittee do the work of content development, right? Take those that are most passionate about the content, that have the subject matter expertise, that have the voice that wants to really be heard in that particular language, and put them into the subcommittee and make sure that they're all there, right? Anybody who has a passion needs to be on that subcommittee. They shouldn't chair every subcommittee, but they should be on those subcommittees where they have a passion. And then have the chair bring that document back to the consensus body when it's time to discuss whether or not we have consensus on the content, right? It's phenomenally helpful to do it in that manner, because the content development is not necessarily going to be the wheelhouse of everybody on your consensus body for every single topic, right? So if we narrow that down to those that are really passionate for or have a subject expertise in that particular area, and let them do that work on the side. What I've found to be very effective in a lot of cases with this, just as a side note, from a procedural standpoint, is typically that chair is going to take the subject and draft it, right? Typically, that's the first step, is to have the chair just draft the content, right? And then present that content out to their subcommittee and say, here's a starting point, right? Let's throw some darts at it. Let's bleed on it, put some red ink on it, and discuss the areas where you feel that, this is off or something's missing, right? And then come back together as a subcommittee once that draft has been reviewed by all the subcommittee members.